waves, spirals and amphibian lemurs, Nickland on time. I have become time, the destroyer of worlds, Hindu god Krishna, in the Bhagavad Gita. In philosophical terms, the deep problem of acceleration is transcendental. It describes an absolute horizon, and one that is closing in. Thinking takes time, and accelerationism suggests we're running out of time to think that through, if we haven't already. Nickland, a quick and dirty introduction to accelerationism. In previous blog posts, I've explored Nickland's relationship to libertarian thought, as well as his subversive irrationalist reading of Kant. So far, however, I have neglected to tackle what he himself considers the central plank of his worldview, his philosophy of time. Land's understanding of time, following in the tradition of Kant, Bergson and Deleuze, and bringing together insights from cybernetics, urban economics and thermodynamics, provides the ontological structure for his accelerationism and all his other major ideas. Energy, time and entropy. In 1965, Robert Oppenheimer reflected on his experiences of the first atomic bomb test, saying it brought to mind an ominous line spoken by Krishna in the Hindu text the Bhagavad Gita, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It's generally agreed that Oppenheimer mistranslated this line. "I have become time, destroyer of worlds" might have been a better rendering. The mistranslation of time as death may seem strange, but, in a certain sense, time and death are very similar phenomena. Both are closely related to the physical concept of entropy. A living thing dies when it falls apart, when it ceases to be an integrated system. In a broader sense, death always means falling apart. Cosmologists talk about the heat death of the universe, a potential scenario in which matter and energy throughout the universe become so evenly spread out that no events can take place anymore. Change requires the dissipation, spreading out, of what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as intensive differences, that is, asymmetric organizations of matter and energy. Once everything is spread out as far as possible, there can be no change and thus no life. After heat death has occurred, there is also no time, that is, time no longer exists. This can be a very difficult concept to wrap one's head around, since we tend to think of time as a kind of absolute framework in which everything resides. But time, the time of physics at least, is something in the universe. The universe is not inside of time. Physicists define time simply as that which a clock measures. In which case, after heat death there would be no clocks and no possibility of there ever being a clock ever again, so hence no time. This is not just a silly semantic issue, but a truly substantive one. A clock is able to measure time in the first place because the clock is animated by energy that flows through it in a process of dissipation. Things change when energy asymmetries dissipate. And if things did not change, we would have no conception of before and after, and hence nothing to think of as time. The process of dissipation that allows the clock to tick is what the clock is measuring. Just like a ruler is only able to measure space by being a substantial, extended object that exists in space. Dissipation is not just something that happens, it is, at root, the only thing that ever happens. This is what gives us the second law of thermodynamics: things always tend to fall apart, energy always tends to spread out. More technically, entropy tends to increase in a closed system, where entropy means disorder or spread outness. This is a statistical law rather than an absolute one, but it is so inviolable at a general level that it might as well be necessary and absolute. The one inescapable fact about the universe is that everything dies. The key issue then is how death can be postponed, and what it means to achieve that. Entropy and the arrow of time. Unlike space, time has a direction. Past comes before present comes before future. We can walk backwards and forwards in space, but time always seems to just march on unchallenged. This directionality of time comes from the second law of thermodynamics, since the natural tendency of everything is to fall apart, and since change depends on this process of dissolution, the direction of time is simply the vector along which things fall apart. To go forwards in time is to dissolve. It is our perception of whether things are falling apart or not that allows us to judge the direction of time. A simple example: you watch a video in which a glass falls from someone's hand and smashes on the floor, alarming perhaps, but quite normal. Next, you watch a video where the glass begins as smashed pieces on the floor. These then spontaneously knit themselves into a perfectly intact glass, which promptly flies up into the air and into someone's hand. The video is clearly being played backwards. How can you tell? Because a glass spontaneously mending and jumping into the air violates the second law of thermodynamics, and our seemingly innate intuitions about the behavior of objects. Yet, as Land points out, processes just as remarkable as a glass knitting itself back together are occurring around us all the time. We just don't notice because we are used to them. When an apartment block gets built, for example, a massive increase in order, that is a massive decrease in entropy, has occurred. Disordered materials have been ordered into a building. Why is this any less astounding than the glass spontaneously mending itself? The obvious answer is that the building was constructed by the energy input and agency of human beings, but this just replaces one astounding phenomenon with another even more astounding one: continued human orderliness. If we accept a materialist ontology, human beings consist of nothing but matter. How then does this matter, which loves to fall apart, manage to maintain itself in such a complex, orderly arrangement as a human being? Physicist Erwin Schrödinger sought to explain this negentropy in his landmark work What is Life? Schrödinger argues that living things, and by extension, complex self-sustaining systems in general, maintain a high state of order by exporting entropy. Humans actually create more disorder, in the form of heat and waste products, than order, but this waste allows us in a certain sense to purchase a temporary orderliness. Order is always maintained by riding on the back of entropic dissolution. At the macroscopic scale at least, something else must always fall apart to pay for an increase in order. This dissolving substrate supports an emergent ordered layer, forming a complex system. Land's rather fascinating contribution at this point is to bring the concept of time back in. If time's direction is simply a function of whether things are falling apart or not, then reductions in entropy are like reversals in time. A complex negentropic system like a human being could be said to rely on the creation of a time anomaly, a temporary and local reversal of the direction of time. This is not quite as bonkers as it sounds. Land, in his Bitcoin and Philosophy seminars, compares this local time reversal to eddies. Eddies are little temporary reversals of flow in a stream of water. They are local reversals, sustained by a general underlying flow in the main direction of the stream. They are emergent phenomena, dependent on an underlying disorder, but they are real reversals of the flow. Similarly, negentropic processes such as life, economic development, the accumulation of intelligence and so on could be seen as temporary, local reversals in the flow of time, negentropic processes as eddies of life in a river of timed death. Waves, loops and urbanomy. Cities are time machines, writes Land, in his brief monograph Templexity. This rather bizarre statement makes a lot of sense in light of what we've just discussed. Like organisms, cities are complex negentropic systems. Perhaps to an onlooking alien's sentience, the flows, flickers, expansions and contractions of a terrestrial city would look like the behavior of some strange metallic organism. Land seems to think so, and agrees with the similar assessment of the urban economist Jane Jacobs. As Land writes in an introduction to Urbanomy, the concept which Jacobs tacitly introduces, as the guiding principle of the urbanomic trend, is auto-production. As it grows, internally specializes, self-organizes, dissipates entropy, and individuates, the city tends to an impossible limit of complete productive autonomy. It appears as a convergent wave, shaped in the direction of increasing order or complexity, as if by an invisible hand, or according to an intelligent design. The pattern is exactly what would be expected if something not yet realized was orchestrating its self-creation. Here we meet two of Land's favorite ideas: 1. The concept of convergent waves, and 2. The idea that such waves constitute a kind of animistic self-creation and reaching back through time. A convergent wave is best understood by comparison to its opposite, a divergent wave. Divergent waves are waves that dissipate, that spread out. When you throw a stone into a pond, the waves created spread out from where the stone hit and gradually get smaller until they disappear. Imagine if the waves started at the edges and came in towards the center, growing larger as they got nearer. That's a convergent wave. If you observed a wave magically spawn at the edge of the pond and rush in towards the center, perhaps you might think the pond was haunted. Such behavior feels like something only an animate, goal-direct system could achieve. The ancient Greek philosopher Thales believed that magnets have souls because they can move together under their own power. Land loves here to bring up the example of the antagonist of Terminator 2, the T-1000, a robot made of liquid metal that can spontaneously reassemble itself if blown apart. It's just like the aforementioned broken glass mending itself and leaping into the air. Perhaps then we can think of cities as huge machines whose job is to provide an epicenter for magically knitting together broken glasses. Cities, through dynamic feedback circuits, create loops that effectively manufacture time. We might think that the major product of cities is capital, goods, networks or infrastructure, but really their major product is time. If aging, which is ultimately the same thing as dying, is the process through which complex structures break down and decay, then cities are gigantic anti-aging devices. Here we can also make sense of Land's statement, in the Dark Enlightenment, that civilization, as a process, is indistinguishable from diminishing time preference. Time preference, aka time discounting, is an economic concept that refers to the extent to which people desire consumption now over consumption later. Having low time preference means you are more willing to defer consumption, viz. Save. Within the framework of Land's philosophy of time, we could say that civilization is indistinguishable from preferring the manufacture of time to the consumption of time. So then, are the feedback circuits that operate in cities primarily negative, homeostatic, that is, are they simply designed to maintain the city and prevent it falling into ruin? No. A city does not simply persist but grow, and the more explosively they grow the more effective we regard them. The job of a city is to serve as the chamber for a controlled explosion. Cities instantiate positive feedback mechanisms, but ones that, since they operate on the time scale of humans and industrial machines rather than nitroglycerine, do not escalate to infinity in an instant, but instead carry out a slow, but accelerating, burn. Cities then present a curious arrangement that instantiates extreme kinds of both progressivism and conservatism. Cities are extremely progressive, not just in a social and cultural sense, but in the sense of being the most intensely operating engines of progress. This progress, however, is generated by a kind of dynamic conservation, the ceaseless generation of new time loops. Cities could even be called reactionary in the way they fervently insist that time must run backwards. Beyond the pure entropic decay of Detroit, and the museum-like archaism of inner Rome, successful modern cities operate a time-twisting reactionary modernism. Acceleration and techonomic time. Acceleration is the second derivative of a function with respect to time, that is, it is the speed at which the speed of something changes. Per relativity theory, moving at a constant speed and standing still are indistinguishable. Thus, what we feel subjectively as speed is really acceleration. Land tends to use acceleration in a more qualitative than quantitative sense, to refer to both the phenomenon and feeling that things are rapidly getting faster. Land's accelerationism is a worldview that is built ultimately not on a theory of intelligence or capital but of time. We noted earlier that the positive cyclicity inherent in cities and human civilization, their churning nonlinear escalation and explosive growth, is dizzying but not overwhelming because it is bound to a human timescale. However, the more the human economy comes to rely on machines, the more things will proceed by machinic time. Machines as a rule excel at being fast, For example, the world's fastest supercomputer can carry out 100,000 million operations per second. Economies shifting towards machinic time appears as immense acceleration to a human observer. This is why, in his essay Helioplexy, Land says acceleration is technomic time and also calls it the time structure of capital accumulation. The latter is in reference to the theories of the economist Eugen von Bombork, who argued that capitalization of economies occurs through roundabout production where time itself is a source of economic value. With this observation, Bombork intended to refute Marx's labor theory of value, all value comes from labor, and subsequent theory of surplus value and exploitation, capital adds nothing while paying workers less than the full value of their product. According to Land, in a position he traces to a subversive reading of Marx, capitalism is the first economic system in which capitalization exists as an end in itself. That is, capitalism uses human beings as a means of production, and then feeds the fruits of this production straight back into itself in order to drive even more production. This is the structure of the positive feedback loop that drives capitalism's accelerative tendency. As capitalism develops, it machinizes, removing human agency more and more from the process in a way that closes the loop tighter and accelerates the system more. As S.C. Hickman points out, there are echoes here of Paul Virilio's idea of instantaneity, in which events under modern capitalism no longer seem to follow one after the other but appear compressed into one gigantic mess. One might also think of Manuel de Landa's concept of robot history as detailed in his War in the Age of Intelligent Machines. For the machines, history has only just begun, and most of history has been compressed into the last century and a half, as well as his observation in The Rise of Realism that the difference between an object and a process is really a matter of perspective. On the timescale of continental drift, our human life is like a flash of light. On the timescale of a supercomputer, our human life is like continental drift. It came from the outside. As the mysterious quail farmer and land scholar Metanamid makes clear in his Acceleration, capitalism as critique, Land's philosophy of time cannot be fully understood without appreciating how he sits within the Kantian tradition. Immanuel Kant believed that the linear procession of time we experience is something imposed on our experiences by a mental faculty called the understanding, and is not part of the real, noumenal, realm beyond our awareness. In other words, linear time is an illusion, real time is occulted that is hidden, existing somewhere outside. Gilles Deleuze takes the Kantian notion of time and reconfigures it, so that the individual human being is no longer the agent that synthesizes the artificial phenomenal time, but merely the passive space in which that synthesizing process occurs. The subject is in fact itself also synthesized by this process. Inspired additionally by Henri Bergson, Deleuze describes three syntheses of time, one each for the present, past and future. As Metanamid states, Deleuze's third synthesis of time is the one most closely related to Land's accelerationist philosophy of time. The synthesized subject, pace Land, is a kind of loop in time. In order for time to move forward then, for a future to be produced, that is for something novel to come to pass, there has to be a break in the loop. Think of it like a record needle being knocked to one side, the needle is still going around in a circle, but the center of the circle has moved to a different position. If we were to trace out this repeated cycling and decentering, it would look like a spiral. Hence Land's assertion that time is a spiral, or in 3 dimensions a helix. The notion of history as helical allows us to synthesize and transcend the notions of linear and cyclical time. A productive force comes from the outside and uses human beings as a means of production. Capitalism for Land, as we've discussed before, is simply the process of creative destruction. In order for capitalism to re-territorialize, to maintain its integrity in the face of the creative energies of the outside, it must incorporate these productive flows into its very being. Capitalism becomes a loop of auto-production. Capitalism is the only system that can withstand this kind of spiraling time structure because it is by its very nature the kind of system that thrives on constantly breaking away from itself. As capitalism bends human beings further and further to fit with machinic time, see the work of Thorstein Veblen on this, it transforms us more and more into the kind of entities that are suitable for capturing and use by the productive forces of the outside. Landian acceleration then, in Metanomid's view, is not fundamentally about things going or seeming faster, but is the temporal mechanism through which capitalism is able to achieve auto-production. The transcendent part of capitalism acts as a temporal thresher, which uses time looping to extract productive potential from the forces flowing through it from the outside. This is what acceleration ultimately means, and this is why his understanding of time lies at the core of Land's worldview. Appendix: What the fuck is Lemurian time sorcery? When he appeared on Metanomid's Hermetics podcast, Nick Land dodged the traditional Hermetics question, choose any 5 thinkers to put in a room and watch their conversation, by choosing to put the syzygetic lemurs in the room instead. No doubt many listeners will have wondered what on earth he was on about. Here Land was referencing the occult side of his work with the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, CCRU, and in particular the concept of Lemurian time sorcery. Lemuria is a mythical lost land that supposedly formed a bridge between Madagascar and India. It was hypothesized by the zoologist Philip Sclater, who was puzzled by the presence of lemurs in both India and Madagascar, despite them being thousands of miles apart. It turns out that India and Madagascar were once joined, forming part of the continent of Gondwanaland. The writer William S. Burroughs references Lemuria in his short story, The Ghost Lemurs of Madagascar, where a man travels to Madagascar and finds it filled with bizarre ancient amphibious beings called lemurs. The lemurs have an ability to manipulate time which is reminiscent of the Kantian perspective on time, they find our own linear notion of time strange and incoherent. This was picked up by the CCRU in their text Lemurian Time War, and served as an inspiration for some of their occult endeavors. The CCRU describe Burroughs realizing that linear time as we perceive it is a prison imposed on us by the outside, and wanting to find methods to escape this prison. For Burroughs, the primary method of escape was his famous cut-up technique, writing texts and then rearranging them in a seemingly random order. For the CCRU, a different method was called for. The CCRU dabbled in a modern form of occultism known as chaos magic. Whereas traditional occultism is liable to a psychologically reductionist criticism, demons/ghosts etc. aren't real, it's all just in your head, chaos magic simply brackets this criticism, remaining agnostic as to whether demons and other occult entities are real or not. Following in the vein of post-structuralism, chaos magicians remain doubtful about the very existence of an objective reality, and assert that beliefs and the way they can be manipulated by certain techniques are all that really matter. In chaos magic then, magic is reduced to a technique for manipulating beliefs in order to achieve particular perceived results. Demons are reduced to psychological entities, like autonomous personas in the mind, that can be summoned, by written symbols called sigils, to carry out certain mental tasks. The lemurs are demons. Specifically, they are demons that live in hell, and are formed by syzygies in the numogram. This might sound like bizarre made-up mumbo-jumbo, and the point is that it is. Chaos magic is about using the power of fiction to manipulate beliefs so as to achieve psychological results. Chaos magicians generate useful fantasies for people to entertain in order to change their perception of the world. The numogram is a diagram consisting of arrows connecting circles with numbers in them. It resembles the tree of life, a diagram used in the Jewish mystical practice Kabbalah. According to the CCRU's website, the numogram is a time map consisting of 10 zones, the circles numbered 0 to 9, organized into 5 pairs called syzygies. These syzygies generate the lemurs, 45 of them in total with 5 syzygetic ones. The lemurs live in hell, which is gate 45, represented by the arrow going from zone 9 to itself with the number 45 written on it. The numogram can be used to carry out Lemurian time sorcery, which is a technique for communicating with the outside and escaping the bounds of linear time.